pretty good team.
That was pretty. It was
What
pretty
made
decent.
that team so good, you two?
Welcome back to Clark USA fans. They say revenge is sweetest when it's served cold. But what if it doesn't come with noise? What if it doesn't need headlines, press conferences, or viral drama to make its impact? What if it arrives quietly, controlled, calculated, and by the time people realize what's happening, everything has already changed? That's exactly what happened. For Caitlin Clark, the moment that shook the entire structure of women's basketball didn't explode onto the scene, it unfolded in silence. No warning, no announcement, just one decision. A decision so unexpected, so deliberate, that it forced the entire basketball world to stop and rethink everything they thought they knew. She walked away from over $1 million in just 8 weeks of play. Let that sink in. In an era where athletes chase every contract, every endorsement, every dollar, she stepped back. No hesitation, no second thoughts. And the question that echoed across the sport was simple. Why? Because this was never about money. This was about control, about timing, about power. This was about rewriting the rules of a system that had underestimated her from the very beginning. And tonight, we're diving deep into the ripple effects of that choice, the moment when one miscalculation by the most powerful voices in women's basketball collided with the rise of a player who refused to wait for permission. Because what followed didn't just shift narratives. It changed everything. Every legendary rise begins with someone else's mistake. Not always a loud one, not always obvious, but a moment, a decision, that in hindsight becomes impossible to ignore. And in this story, that moment belongs to Geno Auriemma. It wasn't a failed play. It wasn't a bad season. It wasn't even a loss in March Madness. It was something deeper. A blind spot. A moment shaped by decades of dominance, where success had become so routine, so expected, that it quietly turned into overconfidence. The kind of confidence that doesn't feel like arrogance anymore because it's been rewarded for so long. Long before Caitlin Clark became the face of women's basketball. Before sold-out arenas. Before record-breaking television ratings. Before rewriting history books and collecting national awards. She was just a kid from Des Moines, Iowa. A kid with a dream. And like so many young players before her, that dream had a destination. UConn. Not just a school, but a dynasty. A program that defined greatness. A place where legends were built. A factory that produced icons Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, Breanna Stewart. If you wanted to be the best, you went through UConn. That was the standard. That was the peak. And for Caitlin Clark, it looked like everything was lining up perfectly. A generational scorer. Elite vision. Unlimited range. A player who could see the game 2 steps ahead of everyone else. On paper, it should have been automatic. But reality told a different story. The connection never fully formed. The door never truly opened. What should have been a perfect match turned into a missed opportunity, and that single moment would go on to shape the future of the entire sport. Because here's the truth, the interest from UConn was never serious. There were light touches. A few indirect conversations through her AAU coach. Casual check-ins. Nothing meaningful. Nothing direct. And most importantly, Geno Auriemma never called her. Not once. He didn't reach out to her personally. He didn't connect with her family. He didn't make her feel like a priority. And in recruiting, silence speaks louder than anything else. Because when the time came to explain how one of the most obvious talents in the country slipped through the cracks, the answer revealed everything. He said he had already committed to another point guard, Paige Buchers. And he didn't want 2 players at the same position in the same class. On the surface, that explanation sounded reasonable.
But they're not going to do that. And with Noelle Quinn, as you mentioned, no challenge.
Clark.
But then came the part that changed everything. He suggested that if Caitlin Clark really wanted to play for UConn, she should have been the one to call him. Think about that. One of the greatest recruiters in basketball history, expecting a teenager to chase him down. That wasn't just a missed opportunity. That was a statement. A dismissal. And for a player like Clark, that kind of moment doesn't disappear. It stays. It builds. It becomes fuel. While UConn moved forward without a second thought, Caitlin Clark didn't forget. She understood exactly what it meant. She wasn't their choice. She didn't fit their system. She wasn't part of their plan. And in that moment, one of the most powerful programs in the sport quietly closed the door on the player who would go on to define an entire generation. So she chose a different path. Iowa. Not a dynasty. Not a powerhouse. Not a program stacked with banners and legacy. But something else. Something more important. Freedom. At Iowa, she wasn't going to be just another piece in a system. She was going to be the system. Head coach Lisa Blutter saw what others didn't, or maybe what others refused to fully embrace. She handed Clark the keys from day one. No restrictions. No limitations. No fear of mistakes. Just trust. And that changed everything. Because generational talent doesn't thrive in control, it thrives in freedom. At Iowa, Caitlin Clark wasn't asked to fit into a mold. She was allowed to break it. The offense ran through her. The energy of the team followed her. Every possession, every decision, every moment on the court, it all moved with her rhythm. And that kind of trust? It's rare. It's something she never would have had in a system built on decades of rigid structure and hierarchy. At UConn, the program was always bigger than the player. At Iowa, the player became the program. And it didn't take long for the world to notice. It started quietly. Packed gyms in Iowa City. Clips going viral before games even ended. Fans sharing impossible shots, logo threes that didn't just score points, they made statements. Every game became an event. Every shot became a moment. And during her freshman season, she made one thing clear: she didn't just belong at this level. She was here to dominate it. Averaging over 26 points per game as a freshman, she wasn't easing into college basketball. She was taking it over. And with every game, every record, every sold-out arena, that early rejection became louder. What once looked like a small recruiting decision turned into one of the biggest misreads in basketball history. Because this wasn't just about wins and losses anymore. This was about impact, about culture, about attention, about money left on the table, about moments that could have belonged to one program, but instead reshaped the entire sport somewhere else. Caitlin Clark didn't just rise. She forced the game to evolve around her. And the system that once overlooked her now had no choice but to watch. And the most powerful part? She never needed to say a word. No revenge speeches. No public callouts. No drama. Just performance. Just dominance. Just control. Because sometimes the loudest statement is silence backed by results.
Here comes Sabali. Clark.
By the time Caitlin Clark stepped into her sophomore season, something undeniable was already happening. This wasn't just improvement. This wasn't just development. This was domination. Night after night, she wasn't just leading Iowa, she was leading the entire nation in scoring. And with every performance, she was dragging a program that had lived in the shadows for decades, straight into the national spotlight. Not slowly, not quietly, but forcefully. The game itself was changing in real time, and whether they were ready or not, everyone was being pulled along with it. Coaches had to adjust. Defenses had to stretch farther than ever before. Analysts had to rethink how they even talked about greatness. Entire conferences had to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. Because Caitlin Clark wasn't following the game. She was reshaping it. While that transformation was unfolding on courts across the country, there was another story happening in parallel. A quieter one, but just as important. On one side, you had a player building something entirely new, possession by possession, shot by shot, moment by moment. On the other side, you had a legacy trying to hold its ground. Geno Auriemma stayed focused on protecting what he had built over 4 decades. Championships. Systems. A reputation that had defined excellence for generations. But while he was looking backward, guarding history, Clark was looking forward, creating it. And the gap between those two mindsets? It was growing wider every single day. By her junior season, Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the record books. She took control of them. She broke the NCAA Division I all-time scoring record. Not just for women. For everyone. She passed Kelsey Plum. She placed her name above every player who had ever stepped onto a college basketball court, male or female. Think about that level of dominance. Think about the weight of that moment. For most athletes, that would be the defining achievement of an entire career. For Caitlin Clark, it felt routine. Just another night. Just another reminder that what she was doing had never been done before. And the impact didn't stop at numbers. Because numbers can be debated. They can be contextualized. They can be explained away. But this couldn't be ignored. Iowa's home games became impossible to attend. Carver Hawkeye Arena packed beyond capacity, night after night. 15,000 seats, gone. Every single time. But the real story wasn't just in Iowa City. It followed her everywhere. On the road, opposing arenas filled up like never before. Fans drove for hours, sometimes across states, just to watch her play. Even if it meant cheering against their own team. That's not fandom. That's a phenomenon. And then came the moment that proved just how big this had become. The 2023 NCAA Championship Game. Iowa versus LSU. Over 9 million viewers tuned in. At that point, it became the most watched women's college basketball game in history. But that wasn't the peak. That was just the beginning. 1 year later, the rematch. The number didn't just grow, it exploded. 7 million viewers. Let that number breathe for a second. That didn't just break records. It shattered them. It outperformed most men's college basketball broadcasts. It forced networks, ESPN and beyond, to completely rethink how they treated women's basketball. This wasn't background programming anymore. This wasn't filler content buried in inconvenient time slots. This became must-watch television. Appointment viewing. A cultural moment. And here's the most important part. This didn't happen by accident. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some natural upward trend. Caitlin Clark didn't walk into a rising wave. She created it. With her work. With her confidence. With her refusal to accept anything less than the spotlight she knew she deserved. She didn't need banners hanging above her head. She didn't need validation from a system that had ignored her. She didn't need approval from a coach who never made the call. She took what Iowa gave her and turned it into something the entire world couldn't look away from. Because somewhere in the past, there was a moment. A gym in Des Moines. A young player waiting for a phone call that never came. And instead of letting that moment define her limits,
her team is beating Indiana, and that's exactly.
She used it to define her path. While her rise unfolded across every screen in America, one thing became impossible to ignore. The silence from the past wasn't just silence anymore. It had turned into resistance. Geno Auriemma watched from a distance. And instead of acknowledging what had happened, instead of admitting the miss, instead of simply saying, "We got it wrong," he doubled down. He chose pride over reflection, arrogance over honesty. And in doing so, he made the gap even more visible. Every time Caitlin Clark's name came up, the pattern was the same. A compliment, wrapped inside a subtle dismissal. He would smile, call her fearless, say she played like a kid in a driveway. At first glance, it sounded harmless, even kind. But underneath, it stripped away the work, the discipline, the mastery. Because in that framing, she wasn't a generational talent. She was just improvising, just playing, as if what she was doing could be replicated by anyone. As if greatness like hers didn't require years of obsession, sacrifice, and precision. And it didn't stop there. Every time she was praised, she was pulled into comparisons. Her achievements were never allowed to stand alone. If she was called tough, another name followed. If she connected with fans, someone else was mentioned in the same breath. Every compliment came with a tether. A reminder that, in his world, the real standard still lived somewhere else. But outside that bubble, the reality was already clear. The power had shifted. Caitlin Clark didn't need permission. She didn't need validation. She didn't need approval from any legacy system. Her impact was moving on its own, growing louder, getting bigger, reaching further, week after week. And with every sold-out arena, every viral clip, every record-breaking broadcast, it became undeniable. The influence in women's basketball no longer belonged to one program, or one voice, or one man. And then came the moment where everything crossed a line. June 2024. An interview. The Dan Patrick Show. This time, there was no subtlety, no careful wording, no indirect framing. Geno stopped talking around Caitlin Clark and started pushing directly against the wave surrounding her. But he didn't aim at her. He aimed at the people supporting her, her fans. He dismissed them, questioned them, suggested they didn't understand the game, that they were irrational, that they were damaging the sport by believing in her too much. And all of that came from one idea, one belief, that Caitlin Clark, as a rookie, could finish among the top 4 in MVP voting. To him, that wasn't excitement. That wasn't optimism. It was something to mock, something to tear down. He called those fans disrespectful, unknowledgeable, even stupid. He said they were giving women's basketball a bad name. And think about that for a second. The same fans who were filling arenas, driving ratings to historic levels, turning the sport into a global conversation, were now being labeled as the problem. But here's the truth that no statement could erase. You don't get 7 million viewers by accident. You don't sell out arenas across the country by mistake. You don't rewrite the economics of an entire sport without being exactly who people believe you are. Caitlin Clark didn't argue. She didn't respond. She didn't need to, because her answer had already been written in numbers, in moments, in history, and most importantly, in impact that no one could control anymore.
Caitlin Clark's second deep shot.
There's a moment in every era when power reveals itself not in strength, but in how it reacts when control begins to slip. And this was that moment. A Hall of Fame coach. A man with championships stacked higher than most could ever imagine. A figure who had long been seen as the authority in women's basketball. And yet, he turned his attention not toward the game, but toward the people who were lifting it higher than ever before. The fans. The families filling arenas. The young girls showing up wearing number 22 for the first time. The parents buying jerseys, tickets, and hope in equal measure. The casual viewers, people who had never watched women's basketball a day in their lives, suddenly tuning in because one player made them care. That energy? That movement? That cultural shift? He looked at it and dismissed it, as if it didn't matter, as if it was beneath him. But Caitlin Clark never responded. No interviews, no statements, no social media posts, no back and forth. Because she understood something most people don't when you're building something real. You don't argue. You perform. And what came next wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't open for interpretation. She stepped into the league and delivered. Rookie of the Year. First team All-WNBA. And when the MVP votes were finalized, she finished 4th. Exactly where those same uninformed fans said she would. Let that reality settle in. The people who were mocked were right. And in that single sequence, everything shifted. Because it didn't just validate Caitlin Clark. It exposed something deeper. Every dismissive comment, every backhanded compliment, every attempt to downplay her impact, collapsed under the weight of real results. What was once framed as hype became undeniable truth. And just like that, the role of gatekeeper disappeared, replaced by something else entirely. The image of a man watching the game move forward, without him. But words only go so far. Eventually, commentary isn't enough. If you want control back, you need something real, something tangible. And that's where everything changed. Because after trying to ignore her, after trying to minimize her, after trying to reshape the narrative around her, there was only one move left. Bring her in. Attach her success to your system. And reclaim relevance through her rise. That opportunity came in the form of a new league. Unrivaled. A bold idea. A new platform. Backed by big names. Built with ambition. Funded with serious money. But missing one thing. The one thing that actually mattered. Attention. Because no matter how strong the structure looked on paper, there was only one player in the world who could instantly make people care. One name that could bring legitimacy, visibility, and momentum in a single move. Caitlin Clark. And suddenly, everything changed. The same system that once overlooked her, needed her, the same voice that never called, was now reaching out. The same perspective that questioned her impact, was now trying to benefit from it. The offer came.
Inside against the taller Mercedes Russell and
Over $1 million. 8 weeks. One of the biggest deals ever presented in women's basketball. On the surface, it looked like opportunity. But underneath, it told a completely different story. Because the irony was impossible to ignore. The same coach who never picked up the phone when she was a teenager was now putting a massive check in front of her, hoping she would say yes, hoping she would become the face of something he was connected to, hoping she would bring her audience, her influence, her movement back into his orbit. The roles had reversed. Completely. The gatekeeper was now asking for access. But here's what he never understood. Not once. Not at the beginning. Not in the middle. And not even at the end. She never needed him. When the offer reached Caitlin Clark, she didn't see opportunity. She saw intent. She saw pressure. She saw a system that had never believed in her, trying to pull her back in when it was convenient. And her response was the same as it had always been. Calm. Controlled. Final. She said no. No drama. No explanation. No hesitation. Just a decision. And that decision carried more weight than anything said over the previous years. Because this wasn't just about a contract. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about basketball. This was about power. When she declined, she wasn't turning down an offer. She was rejecting the idea that her success needed validation. She was rejecting the system that once ignored her. She was rejecting the final attempt to tie her story back to someone else's legacy. She chose independence. She chose control. She chose her own path. And in that moment, everything shifted. Because what happens when the rules that governed a sport for decades suddenly stop applying? What happens when the voices that once controlled every opportunity lose their grip? What happens when one player proves that you don't need permission anymore? You get change. Real change. A league forced to rethink its foundation. A system forced to question its authority. A generation of athletes watching closely, realizing that the path forward doesn't have to follow the past. And the most powerful part? She didn't fight for it publicly. She didn't demand it. She didn't argue for recognition. She simply took it. Through timing. Through leverage. Through decisions made on her own terms. And now, the ripple effects are just beginning. Because once control shifts, it never fully goes back. The question isn't what Caitlin Clark has already changed. That part is clear. The real question is, what's next? Which systems are about to be challenged? Which traditions are about to be rewritten? Which voices will rise? And which ones will fade into the background? Because this story was never just about one player. And it was never just about one league. It's about what happens when someone refuses to play by the old rules. The next chapter is already unfolding. The momentum is already building. The shift is already in motion. And now there's only one question left: who's going to write what comes next?